She believed she was in charge. She thought she had everything under control. But when Officer Emily Ward hits a man during a regular traffic stop, she quickly learns how a single misstep can unravel everything. The evening had been calm, a peaceful shift Officer Emily Ward usually preferred. It was late, nearly 10:30 p.m., and traffic in the quieter part of Oakwood had nearly come to a halt. She sat in her patrol car, parked near a quiet intersection, watching a few passing cars. That's when she spotted it. A dark sedan cruising through the nearby light. It looked expensive, sleek and polished like it had just been driven off a showroom floor. The car seemed fine, except for one detail. It hadn't signaled while turning. Technically, it was a minor infraction, a small one, sure, but it gave her a reason to make the stop. And maybe, just maybe, Emily thought it was time to remind people that rules were meant to be followed. She turned on her siren and cruised after the vehicle, closing the gap between them. A quick flash of lights, and the car's brake lights blinked on, coming to a smooth halt. Emily stepped out slowly, one hand resting on her belt, the other adjusting her radio. The street was eerily silent, with only a distant hum of street lights above. As she approached the driver's side, the window slid down at a deliberate pace. There he was, a black man in his late 40s, well-groomed with a neat beard and a fitted suit. He looked like he belonged in a car like that. His hands were steady on the wheel, not nervous, just waiting. His gaze was direct, unwavering. Emily felt a strange discomfort in her chest. There was something about his composed demeanor, something that didn't sit right with her. "License and registration," she demanded, her voice sterner than she intended. The man blinked and then calmly reached for his glove compartment. No rush, no hesitation. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" His voice was smooth, level. Emily crossed her arms. "You didn't signal back there." The man paused, his eyes momentarily narrowing. "Did I?" he asked, his tone polite, but with an edge that felt almost challenging. Her gaze narrowed in return. She didn't like the way he spoke. It wasn't rude, just insistent. "License and registration," she repeated, more sharply this time. Without protest, he handed her the documents, his movements slow and controlled. His steady, calm composure irritated her. She barely skimmed his ID, barely glancing at the name before flipping it over. His self-assuredness made her uneasy. "Do you live around here?" she asked, her voice tinged with an authority she was starting to feel she might be losing. He exhaled slightly through his nose, the quiet sound almost like a challenge in itself. "I don't think that's relevant," he said. Emily's grip tightened around his ID. She had worked on the force long enough to recognize when someone wasn't taking her seriously, and when someone thought they could push boundaries without consequences. Straightening, she said firmly, "Get out of the car." His face didn't change, but the muscles in his jaw tensed. He tilted his head, studying her. "Why?" I said, "Get out," she repeated. He didn't argue. He unbuckled his seatbelt, exhaled softly, and stepped out of the car. He was taller than she expected, with a broad build that made her feel like he was looming. But his posture was relaxed, no sign of aggression. Still, there was something about him that made her heart beat a little faster. She gestured to the back of the car. Hands on the trunk. He exhaled again, his breath even and controlled, as he turned to lean his palms against the cool metal. Emily's pulse quickened. This was her moment, a reminder of who was in control. This was supposed to reaffirm her authority. Reaching forward, she placed a hand lightly on his back, urging him to bend slightly. The moment she did, something inside her snapped. Before she thought it through, before her mind caught up with her actions, she struck him, her palm slapping his cheek in a sharp, resounding crack. The man's head jerked to the side, and the silence that followed felt like it stretched on forever. His body froze. Emily's breath hitched, a rush of panic flooding her. The world felt still. Time seemed to stop. Slowly, he turned his head back toward her, his expression unreadable. His jaw clenched just for a second, and then he took a long, controlled breath. And then, with almost mechanical precision, he reached into his jacket pocket. Emily's stomach dropped. He pulled out a badge. "Marcus Davis," he said, his voice still calm. Her eyes flicked down to the title beneath his name. "Police Chief." Her stomach churned. The ground beneath her feet felt as if it had just cracked open. She had just struck her superior officer. He wasn't angry. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand an explanation. He just looked at her. Emily could barely breathe. Her mind was racing, but nothing made sense. Chief Davis, she couldn't find the right words. She couldn't explain it. Before she could finish, a voice from behind interrupted her. Is everything all right, Officer Ward? She spun around, startled. Another patrol car had pulled up. Officer Miller, her partner for the night, stood by, confusion painted across his face. Chief Davis spoke before Emily could open her mouth. Everything's fine, he said, smoothly slipping his badge back into his pocket. This officer was just conducting a stop. He continued, giving no hint of anger or frustration. Miller looked between the two, raising an eyebrow. Sir, he began. Davis didn't look at Miller. His gaze stayed locked on Emily, making her feel even more exposed. Am I free to go? He asked, his voice quiet but carrying weight. Emily hesitated. Her fingers twitched at her sides. This was it, the moment she had to decide. Let him go. Hope he wouldn't report the incident. Try to regain control of the situation. She cleared her throat. A soft chuckle came from Davis. No warmth, no amusement, just something cold. Officer Ward, he said, his voice low. Am I being detained? The pressure from Miller's gaze intensified, now laced with concern. He didn't know what had happened. The words felt like they burned her throat. No, sir. Davis nodded, glancing toward Miller. Good to see the department still has some professionals, he said. Without another word, he walked back to his car, climbed inside, and the door clicked shut. Emily stood there, frozen, as his car slowly pulled away and disappeared into the night. The moment the sedan was gone, Miller turned to her, his face now filled with confusion. Emily, what happened? He asked. Her jaw tightened, and she shook her head. It was just a stop. A stop, Miller said, his brow furrowing. You look like you've seen a ghost. What did he say to you? He pressed. Nothing, she muttered, her voice barely audible. That was the problem. He hadn't said anything. No threats, no anger, just silence that left her feeling more exposed than any reprimand ever could. Miller stared at her for a moment before exhaling. I'll handle the paperwork. Are you all right? He asked, his voice quiet with concern. Emily swallowed hard, but the truth felt too heavy to say. Yeah. Miller hesitated but then nodded, returning to his patrol car. Emily turned back to her cruiser. But as she reached for the door, a cold weight settled deep in her stomach. Marcus Davis had let her go without a scene. No immediate consequences, but she could feel it. He wasn't finished with her yet. That night, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment. The way he had looked at her, how he'd let her walk away without a word. No threats, no consequences, just silence, heavy and deliberate. It was worse than anything she could have expected. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. Emily couldn't shake the image of Marcus Davis's calm gaze, the way he had let her walk away without a word. His silence weighed on her more than any reprimand could. She kept replaying the encounter in her mind, dissecting every second, searching for a mistake, a moment where things could have gone differently. But the truth was, she wasn't sure what to make of it. In the days that followed, things at work felt different. She couldn't look her colleagues in the eye without wondering if they knew. The way they spoke to her, the way they acted around her, it was like she was already under a microscope. Emily had always prided herself on being in control, on knowing how to handle any situation. But now, with every glance, she felt exposed. And Marcus Davis? She didn't know when or if he'd come for her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the moment of silence hadn't been forgiveness. It had been a warning. The weight of it lingered in the back of her mind, making it harder to sleep, harder to focus. She knew one thing for certain. Things would never be the same again.